All right, so this event is called Should I Stay or Should I Go? And it's because this is really focused on relationships at large. Like the pictures here are designed to show you that, yeah, there could be a relationship between a romantic partner, but it could also be work relationships. It could be sibling relationships. It could be any relationship you could imagine. Sometimes the real big question is, do we stay in it? Do we put effort into it, or do we just leave it? And it's a really important question, because if we don't really understand what's causing the relationships to become strong or to not work, we won't really have any certainty about this. So what I would say up front is that most people have relationships that they can work on and improve greatly, but there are some we can't. And so that it's kind of a twofold message. I've spent decades helping people to build strong relationships, and then realized a really big piece of information about the relationships we can't fix. I wanted to open by saying this statement because originally this topic basically came out of a question that was asked on Facebook, which was, what would you tell somebody if they were getting ready to go through a divorce? That was the question that was presented on Facebook. And I said, oh my gosh, knowledge is power. I would tell that person to go and learn these terms. And I listed a bunch of terms that I'm going to cover in this presentation. Because when I discovered a few things about 2 to 3 years ago, it was very, very life-changing. And that's where the information started for me in presenting some of what I'm presenting today. So I wrote an article called When You Can't Fix or Help a Relationship. And women would call me, in particular women, it could have been men, but it happened to be women, called me and they were in tears saying, oh my gosh, one woman said, I'd been married 40 years. I was a Christian woman. I would go for counseling to my pastor and he would continuously tell me about how to be a better Christian wife. And then she would feel so discouraged. So she eventually left her marriage, felt tremendous shame and guilt over it. And when she read the article, she goes, oh my God, so many things fell in place. I don't feel like I have to carry this weight of guilt and confusion. And she said, I've canceled everything today just because I want to cry and let this go. And that's how powerful it is when we have understanding. And a similar thing happened when I brought some of this information to some events and presented it to groups. People in the crowd would cry and they would say, why aren't we hearing this information? Why don't we know more about this? The first part of this whole presentation is going to be, what if it can't be fixed? What if this relationship, it could be with my mom or dad, it could be with my boss or my coworker, it could be with my direct report, it could be with my children. What if it can't be fixed? So I'm going to go into that first. Before I go too far into it, though, I want to define some terms. My guess about you who are on this call are that you are likely empaths, because empaths are people who are aware of the emotions of those around them, and they are the people that see the world a little differently because they're keenly aware of relationships and aware of others and aware of pain and they're aware of emotional concerns and considerations. So I'm going to just make that jump, that it's very possible or probable that you're an empath. And I also want you to know empath itself is a complex topic. There are a lot of different types of empaths. There are people that they can be in the room with somebody that has a headache and they'll start feeling tension in their head. There can be people who can feel the emotions of the people in the room and maybe even beyond in the room. There are people like me who are intuitive empaths or cognitive empaths. I can pick up on subtle cues that allow me to hear tone of voice, body language, word choices. There are people that even are empathic through dreams and through animals and all kinds of things. So just that in itself might be something you want to look into if you see in yourself, gosh, I think I might be an empath. But here are some other qualities that are common to empaths. We tend to be very helpful people. We tend to want to help even when it's costly to us. We tend to be idealistic. We want to see goodness in everyone and everything and look for bringing about positive change. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just something that we do to a high degree. We're very trusting. We want to assume that everyone has the same sensitivities that we have and that, everybody has good intent, that sort of thing. Relationships are very high priority to people who are empathic. So if you're relating to this, I just want you to know these are probably things you're going, yep, check, check. We make priorities very important, and we're very hurt when they're not important to other people. We seek those emotional connections. I look at it as I have relationships with some people who are very open-hearted and very psychologically safe. And that's what empaths really love to have in their lives. It's everything to us. The other thing that's important to know is I'm going to be talking about different types of narcissism. And empaths are kind of like nectar to the honeybee of a narcissist, because we are generous, we are helpful, and we can often be taken advantage of as a result of that. Not always, but often we are a draw. So the empath narcissist combination of relationships is a common occurrence. So for some of you might have already heard this, but for some of you, this might be news. By the way, I have tons of articles I can send you on this combo. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal experience with why this information was important to me. I was married for over 20 years. I have been divorced almost 20 years. And the entire time that I was married and almost the entirety of my divorce period, I never once thought of my ex-husband as a narcissist. And I want to preface what I'm saying about him as I am not saying this to demonize him or to say that he was a person that, I don't even believe he could help it that he was a narcissist. But I had no idea that he could be a narcissist because he just didn't present like what I would call the garden variety of narcissists. So when I would think of narcissists, I would think of somebody who's very arrogant, who's very self-righteous, and who brags a lot and acts very much like they think they're, God's gift to the world, are the kind of person that would use power without consideration for other people, and who appears very status conscious and vain and self-absorbed, and who would be really selfish at, kind of a shocking level, and that they really want power and domination. So that's kind of my picture of narcissism. And the attitude that I would see in people that I would qualify as narcissists is that they think they're smarter and better than everyone, everyone everywhere. And so it's really, I think most people would probably describe, if you ask them, what is a narcissist? What I didn't know are two other kinds of narcissist, and one of them is called vindictive narcissist. And when a person is a vindictive narcissist, one of the things that they do, and this is probably true for all narcissists, but this is the kind of narcissism that my ex-husband had. And I did not know of this, and I did not understand that this was a thing. And so when I was in it, it just completely confused me. But in his version of narcissism, he did a lot of gaslighting. He would do things that would throw me off. And if you don't know what gaslighting is, you might want to go and look it up and do some research on it. But there was even a movie called Gaslight. And it was about a man who was trying to make his wife kind of go crazy. So he would have lights flickering in the house, and she'd say, "Oh my God, did you see the lights flickering?" And he'd say, "What are you talking about? I don't see any lights flickering," because it was very crazy making that he would do that. Well, in my marriage, there was a lot of gaslighting, but it was really subtle, and it was really kind of out of the blue. And I always left even minor gaslighting sort of wondering if I was imagining or making something out to be something it wasn't. An example of this would be, I might say, "Hey, honey, are you ready to go?" No answer. "Hey, hey, can you hear me? It's time to go." No answer. "Hey, can you hear me?" And then him saying, "Quit screaming at me." And I started feeling crazy. Like, was I being a nag? Was I doing something wrong? Was I being impatient? So gaslighting can be done in a lot of different ways that are more subtle than we might think. Also, what I noticed after this whole process of being married and divorced was how frequently my ex would break boundaries. I mean, even one of my daughters went to counseling and said, when I ask my dad to stop tickling me, he won't. When I tell him I don't want to be hugged, he'll force a hug. When I tell him I don't want to sit on his lap, he'll force me to sit on his lap. And while those weren't like overt sexual abuse, they were abusive because they were disrespect for boundaries. And that happened a lot. They will do things that hurt and annoy you, either subtly or overtly. They're kind of torturous. And the way that I see it now, it's so obvious to me now. It's like nice, nice stab, nice, nice stab. And you can't see it coming. Sometimes you're not even certain it was intentional. But one of the ways I could really see it in my relationship would be that I would be home with my kids, everybody'd be peaceful, and within 15 to 20 minutes after my ex would come home, one of the kids would be crying, and you could hear that sort of torturous annoyance or crying that would occur after he was home for a little bit. They often lie and distort, and I would say that's probably true of all narcissists, but I know it was definitely true in my instance. And a lot of times when I would see this distortion, I would think, well, gosh, do I remember it wrong? Or how could he say that it went that way? It would shock me, and it would surprise me, and it would make me completely feel uncomfortable. Another thing that's really true about vindictive narcissism is that they are committed to exacting revenge. So they almost kind of revel in a punishment sort of energy. In fact, in the case of my ex-husband, his father kind of taught him that. He used to say, I don't get even, I get ahead. So that kind of mentality is a very revenge-oriented mentality. And by the way, I do want to also say, I really believe from all the research I've done that narcissism comes from an abusive set of conditions that occur in the life of the narcissist. So I'm not saying that they are free of the causes of their narcissism. In fact, from what I've read, narcissism is a coping mechanism that allows the person that has been so deeply wounded to feel safe in their own life. But I remember when I was really early in my marriage and I was actually pregnant, my mother had passed away and we were having an argument. And he said to me, if you ever leave me, I'll take the kids from you. And I remember thinking, who says that? Who even thinks that? But that's the kind of thought that a vindictive narcissist would have. I just didn't know that that's what it was. In fact, in my mind, I was so shocked and distressed. I just thought, he doesn't mean that. He would never do that. So I just want you to pay attention to where these kinds of things might be happening. Because when I read these kinds of things, I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what was going on in my marriage. And it was subtle rather than overt. So it was more difficult to recognize. Like I said, I've only learned this stuff the last couple of years. After I got divorced in 2001, I went about 4 years without even dating. I was in a lot of confusion about how come I couldn't save my marriage. How could I be in the field of human systems and psychology and not understand what happened? And I didn't date for a long time. And then eventually when I did date, I dated a man who I now recognize was in this form of narcissist. But I didn't know it at the time. I just had the symptoms and the experiences that go with this kind of narcissism in case this is someone in your life. So a covert narcissist is somebody who appears very giving. They even appear almost like an empath would appear. They're the kind of person that would go over and shovel the neighbor's driveway. They're the person who can appear very kind and gentle and very considerate. They are really good at doing love bombing, which if you haven't heard that term, it's a term that is about making the person that they're with feel completely adored and desired. And it's really intoxicating when you receive love bombing, especially if you've, been confused about different relationships and then somebody comes along and knows how to do this with you and to you. They also use something called intermittent reinforcement, which I'm going to go into a little bit further in this presentation. And it was super critical for me to eventually understand what intermittent reinforcement is. But in a kind of simple explanation is they start with the love bombing and then they start becoming inconsistent with it, which allows you to start developing like an addiction. Kind of like when people do drugs and it works one time and then it doesn't, and then they take more drugs, it's that kind of cycle. The other thing that I know about most narcissists, but I saw in this particular relationship, is that just like a cult leader, the person who is in this covert narcissism, they will try to get you to be separate from the people that are your best supporters and your best empowerment connections, that sort of thing. I remember with this particular person, right before I broke it off with him, it was my birthday. And I said, hey, my kids want to celebrate me with cake and ice cream tonight. What time do you want to go do that? Because I know we're going to dinner. And he said, well, I'm your partner. Why would you choose them over me? And I said, well, I'm not trying to choose, them over you. I'm saying, why don't we do both? Why don't we either go to eat dinner and then go with them, or go with them and then go to eat dinner? And he said, I just can't believe that you would choose them over me, your partner. And I had the self-esteem to be able to say, I can't believe you would try to get me to choose, because I could recognize that what he was doing was wrong, but I was shocked that it was occurring. And that was just one example. So just hopefully some of this might be hitting you. Oh gosh, I have a relative or a neighbor or somebody who is doing all these things, and I haven't been able to understand that this could be narcissism. I remember this particular man, he said, he told me this one time, I'm really good at loving people. I've never had anyone leave me without running back to me. And I look at that and think that is really kind of sick. Like, you're proud of the fact that you can get people addicted to you, and that somehow validates you're good at loving them. I do know myself that when I left the relationship, I wanted to go running back, because the whole dynamic of narcissism in this form can really cause you to choose a relationship that's not a relationship, but that's an addiction. So I just want you to be aware of some of these traits. If you're like me, you didn't even know this kind of narcissism existed. So here's what all narcissists have in common. They lack compassion and empathy. They don't really feel guilt and remorse. They're playing by a totally different handbook. Everything they're doing is around control. It's a fear of being hurt again. And it's all about, I have to be in control. And that's what feeds me, is being able to be the person in control. According to most of the books I've read about this, and most of the podcasts and recordings I've heard on this topic, the top experts say that narcissists do not want to change. It's rare that there's an occasion where a narcissist appears to have changed. Sometimes they will look like they're changing for you, but it's just to pull you back into that relationship. And as soon as you're back in that relationship, they'll stop doing the behavior, like going to a counselor or whatever, that pulls you back in. So you don't actually see true and lasting change occurring that you do in a person that's really seeking growth. So that's kind of discouraging. I remember finding out that there's a larger group of people that have narcissistic tendencies and versions of psychopathy, which is the same as a psychopath, only not the murderous type. It's about 10% of the population that don't have this empathy and compassion. I can almost guarantee people personally that fit into this group, and they might even appear charming, and they might even appear helpful in some ways. And being the empath that I am, and the person that I am, wanting to go create a world where people love their lives, I had to grieve the fact that there are more people than I knew walking around who look normal. They don't look like schizophrenics or something more obvious, that I cannot reach, that I cannot touch. And I don't want to say they never will change. I want to say that with the current consciousness of our planet, it's okay for me to forgive myself that I can't change them, and it's okay for you to as well. So I never want to give up on the notion that they can change, but right now it doesn't seem apparent that they are. Now, you might be seeing some of these things that I'm talking about and starting to go, well, gosh, sometimes I do that. What if I'm a narcissist? So I want to tell you a couple of things. In every relationship where you have been a victim of a narcissist, small or large incidents, it will cause you to be more protected, self-protected, more shut down, more self-centered, and you may be temporarily a little more narcissistic. I remember at the worst in my marriage, I felt guilty leaving because I wasn't being beaten. My ex-husband had a good job. He wasn't doing anything real crazy the way that you think of when you leave a marriage. But I was very self-focused because I was in so much pain and confusion. So we all act a little narcissistic depending upon our level of discouragement and our level of loving support. But if you're worried that you're a narcissist, you're not a narcissist. I remember reading this in a book. I was reading all the way through this part and I started worrying, oh my God, what if I'm a narcissist? And the person wrote in the next paragraph, if you're worried right now that you're a narcissist, just know you aren't. because a narcissist would never ask the question, oh my gosh, what if I'm a narcissist? They would never ask it. And if you tried to ever convince them they would be wildly resentful and defensive, because a narcissist, the last thing they will do is self-examination and desire to change. So don't worry if you see yourself in some of these descriptions. The next thing I want to talk about, because some of you might be dealing with this yourself, I know when I learned this information, I saw a little bit of this in my parents. I saw my mother try to poison us a little bit against my father, not to the extent that I'm going to describe next, but it was enough that I recognized it when I learned of this information. But one of the things that happened in my divorce process, which was extremely painful and resulted in long-term harmful effects, was that when a parent alienates a child from the other parent, and that there's a term for it called parental alienation. I never had heard of this. I didn't know how to distinguish it between other kinds of things that go on between parents and children. I remember during the divorce process, I was super highly committed to not saying bad things about my ex to my children. I knew that that was a harmful thing to do to them. But at the same time, while I wasn't around, my ex would alienate some of my children. Some of them would not be pulled in, and others allowed themselves to be pulled in, and he would alienate them against me. And I really didn't believe it could happen, because I had such strong relationships with my kids. And what happened was, I remember coming home to my house one time to pick up something, and I saw 2 notes on the counter that he had written to the court in his handwriting, telling them why they didn't want to live with me at all, and that their dad should get full custody. And I remember being so upset and so shocked that he would do that, because it was in his handwriting, that I left and I called my lawyer, and she said, you need to go back and get those letters, because not only are they immoral, they're illegal. It's not allowed to coerce a minor in this way. So of course, when I went back, he was there and denied that the letters had been there and that he had written them, the whole gaslighting thing on that. Where I made the mistake was underestimating how powerful a person's influence is when they're determined to alienate a child from another parent, because I just never believed that 2 of my 5 kids would buy into it. And they were 14 and 16 years old. When I got done learning about parental alienation, I realized this is a national problem that's going on a lot more than people know. And it's highly destructive to everyone involved. And this person, who I'm going to show you a little clip on, she says that we should be working with school districts to make sure that kids are being asked questions like, is one of your parents trying to turn you against the other one? Because that's how, consistent that problem is. And yet it's going unrecognized all over the place, because the person who's doing it is sneaky about it, and they're consistently sabotaging, and nobody knows it's happening because nobody's talking about it with the kids. And so this was a person who, I'm just going to play about 4 minutes of this. Her name is Amy Baker. And if you want, I can send you the links to a couple of longer videos on this, in case this is going on in your life or the life of anybody that you care about or know personally.
One way to think about this is, well, how do we know if a kid who's exhibiting rejection of a parent isn't just rejecting that parent because that parent's abusive, right? We need to know this from a clinical point of view. Judges need to know. They don't want to send a kid to an abusive parent, right? They see a kid who says, I hate that parent and I never want to see that parent again. Well, how do we know that we should protect the child from that parent, or we should work towards a reconciliation? Well, the truth is, I think people make this more complicated than it needs to be, because kids who have been abused by a parent do not exhibit those 8 behavioral manifestations. They do not reject the abusive parent. Kids who have been burned, beaten, molested, the worst things a parent can do to a child, those kids want one thing. They want to go back to that parent. They say, it wasn't mommy's fault. I was bad. That's why mommy hit me, right? That's the classic abuse scenario of a child who's been abused. They don't say, I never want to see that abusive parent again. That's just not how abused kids behave. They blame themselves. and they do not proudly and widely discuss the abuse. Think back to that kid who wrote the letter to the mom's opponent running for the school board. Kids who have been abused do not do that. It's like a breakthrough, a miracle when you're doing therapy with an abused kid, when you finally can get them to admit the details of the abuse. All right, they don't, take out newspaper ads and, announce it to everybody, my parent's a horrible parent, all right? And they don't lack ambivalence. Kids who have been abused will say, well, mommy loses her temper sometimes, or daddy loses his temper and daddy might drink, but he's really good at this and he's really good at that and he really tries hard. They don't have that absolute black and white. Even if they see the abuse and even if they're willing to admit it, they don't wipe out everything good about that parent. And they don't worship the other
So
parent.
I wanted to just show you a little clip of that because it's a very confusing thing to go through parental alienation. You're shocked that it's occurring. You're shocked that your partner would do it to you. You're shocked that your children would get caught up in it. I just can't even begin to tell you the amount of pain that occurred for me in all of these things that I'm sharing with you, the narcissism, the parental alienation. And what happened for me was I was so overwhelmed and under-supported around understanding what was happening and how to get good support that I was barely surviving it. And I think that's bigger than people know. Like, I wasn't being physically beaten or anything, but I was still very beaten down emotionally. So just know when these things are occurring to you in relationships, they're very, very painful and they're very costly. Well, one of the reasons that my two daughters, who were kind of coerced to be completely brainwashed against me, and the reason it was so shocking is because I had been the consistently loving parent to them. Really, I'm not making that up. I mean, I was the one that they could count on, the one that they regularly felt good with. And so it was very surprising to me that they could be wooed away until I learned about intermittent reinforcement. And then until I realized, wow, I was pulled into intermittent reinforcement after the divorce and in that covert narcissist relationship I was in. So intermittent reinforcement, I'm going to play about 4 minutes of this video because in itself, it's a very powerful dynamic that you want to be aware of related to any relationship you're in, because it can be kind of a subtle pull that we're pulled into. So I'm going to play about 4 minutes here, and then I will talk a little bit about this.
Hello there. To begin this episode, I want you to take a trip back in time with me. There's a laboratory, there are scientists, and there are rats. I want you to imagine that there's a rat in a cage. And there's a lever in the cage. Every time this rat pushes the lever, a pellet of food is released. Obviously, after doing this for a time, the scientists become curious. What happens if, when the rat pushes the lever, no pellet comes out? Eventually, the rat loses interest, goes on to preoccupy itself with other things. What do these two experiments have in common? There's consistency in terms of the pattern that the rat perceives. Either they push the lever and a pellet comes out, which is consistency, or they push the lever and a pellet doesn't come out, which is also consistency. This consistency is referred to as continuous reinforcement. So naturally, these scientists became interested. What happens if we create inconsistency in the experiment? What happens if, when the rat pushes the lever, occasionally and randomly and unpredictably, a pellet comes out? They assumed that eventually the rat would become so frustrated that it would lose interest with the lever. In fact, the exact opposite occurred. The rat became absolutely anxiously obsessed with the lever. It kept pressing on it and pressing on it. It had created an addiction, in fact, to the lever. Surprise. So what happens if, after introducing the intermittent reinforcement of that pellet coming out when the rat pushes the lever only occasionally, if the pellets stop completely? Surely the rat would lose interest then. No, the opposite occurred. If the rat received random pellets, once the pellets stopped completely, the rat remained completely obsessively controlling over that lever. It basically became so incredibly addicted to it that regardless of whether it was getting nothing at all, it neglected its grooming habits, and its health deteriorated completely. This rat was engaged in an intermittent reinforcement experiment. Intermittent reinforcement creates addiction. Just think about gambling. The addiction to gambling rests on the laurels of intermittent reinforcement. When you sit down at a slot machine, you absolutely cannot predict the pattern in which the reward is going to come. You may think you can, you may be desperately trying to figure out that pattern so that you can achieve the reward, whatever it is that you want or need, and yet you can't. The desperation that you feel and the starvation of not getting that reward is completely relieved in the moment that you do get that reward. In other words, you get the jackpot, or you even get a random and minor reward out of that slot machine. Oh gosh, it's completely elating. It's amazing to feel that feeling. This addiction is based on intermittent reinforcement. The intermittent reinforcement creates obsession. You become owned by the game. What we have to wake up to is that some of us are in relationships that are based on intermittent reinforcement. In this kind of relationship, the things you need, like love, are only granted inconsistently, unpredictably, and occasionally. But the fact that they're granted occasionally keeps you hooked. You're owned by the relationship. You build up so much despair and starvation that when you get a single scrap, the relief you experience by getting that scrap feels like nirvana, and you begin to chase that feeling and do anything you can to get it. If you're in this kind of a relationship, you're either the scientist tormenting the rat, with the potential of pellets, or you're the rat in the cage caught in the cycle of torment. No matter what, if you're in an intermittent reinforcement relationship, you are in an abusive relationship. Abuse is not usually the conscious intent, but it is abuse nonetheless.
So I wanted to share some of that because I was so fascinated when I learned this information. It was very aligned with what I was just telling you about covert narcissism, where the person love bombs you and you become very addicted to this nirvana of getting some love that you've never gotten from somebody you desperately want to get it from. In the case of my kids, it was they got the love from their dad that they'd always wanted and had never really gotten to the degree that they got. And then creating a dynamic of withholding it from them all at the same time that they were being taught that I was the bad guy and that they were a victim of me and that the family was a victim of me. And it was really helpful for me to know this because I felt so deeply hurt and betrayed that the two daughters could do this. And I tell you this because my youngest daughter at the time of the divorce was only 4 years old. And when I started to get this information was when she was in college and she was taking classes on abuse and, you know, like family abuse. And she was working for a women's shelter for women who are beaten and have to get to a safe place and all that. And she said, had to do a lot of studies on abuse. And she said, Mom, what Dad did to you and to my sisters was the highest form of abuse that could ever occur. And it does the most damage. And I remember saying to her, but they were 14 and 16. And she said they were victims too. And for me, and I hope this is hitting home with you guys a little bit. If not, you know, I apologize if it's not meeting the need. For me, I never wanted to think of myself as a victim, but to know that I had been victimized and to be able to call it what it was the beginning of my healing. For me to have somebody legitimize the fact that what was occurring was highly abusive and highly harmful was important to my own mental health and understanding. It was the beginning of being able to heal and even come to a place of compassion for my ex without falling into the trap of anything that has since occurred. So it was really interesting at the time of the divorce. Once they moved in with him, he immediately dropped all the love bombing from them. It was very confusing for them and difficult for them to process. I don't even believe into this day that they have processed that. But I just want you to be aware of this so that if somebody is sort of betraying you, it could be that they're caught in that addictive cycle with other people involved in the whole process. It could even just be a triangling between family members where somebody's using this tool of intermittent reinforcement, or where you yourself recognize, wow, I'm in an addiction with somebody, not a real relationship with them. So before I go on to let's now look at where relationships can be fixed, because that first half of this event was designed for you to consider maybe something more far-reaching is going on that no matter how intelligent or practiced I am, I won't be able to fix it. And I need very specialized support to understand it and maneuver within it. If I had known what I know now, I would have had a different kind of lawyer. I would have had a different kind of counselor. I would have had different kind of support for my children. Even all of that period afterwards, I would have. So that's why I say knowledge is power, because it can help you be strengthened and be able to maneuver through those situations at less scathed. But before I go into the relationships that can be fixed, do you guys have any questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself and just put them out there.
Is there anything that we can do to combat these techniques?
Yes, I appreciate that question. I've got a ton of data and resources and links. Probably the most helpful book that I read on the topic was a book by a woman gynecologist, Christiana Northrup, and the book is called Dodging Energy Vampires. And even though it goes into a lot of information about narcissism, what it was mostly helpful for is teaching empaths how they can protect their beautiful empathness. Like, for example, I remember once I understood all of this, one of my daughters would call me crying and say, you know, I did this thing with dad and all of a sudden he was real this way and it hurt me so deeply. And I argued with him, like, how could you say that? You know, and I was able to say to her, honey, your dad's pattern is nice stab. When he goes to stab, you don't try to reason with him because he's not using the same rule book that you're using. Because I learned in that book that if somebody is in that pattern of narcissism, you can't fix it. The best you can do is protect yourself. So when that happens, I said, when you feel that stab come in that's completely shocking and unexpected, that's when you say, hey, you know, I think I need to go. This is not feeling good. Let's talk again later. And you just exit the field. So there's lots of good pointers in a book about this kind of really abusive and often unrecognized way of being with people. So I had a client one time, it turned out her mother was a narcissist and she never knew it because her mother was a vindictive narcissist. And by the time she read these articles and watched these videos, and she was just like, oh my God, my life is never going to be the same in a good way. And most importantly, she knew how to kind of protect herself from some of the sort of very destructive behavior that her mother would put on her and her family. So that would be what I would suggest is I'm happy to send you all these links to articles and videos because it really is important that you understand this. And if you've been with people that are narcissistic, it might even be helpful to go the extra step of getting a counselor that can help you work through. For me, it was a game changer to understand this. Okay, so what about those relationships that can be fixed? Because I mentioned that it could be as high as 10% of the population who have that lack of empathy, but that leaves 90% of the population where our problems between them could possibly be helped or fixed. So I'm going to go into why they break down, the ones that are not sort of basically flawed. Part of the reason that we have so many problems in relationships are that we have what's called an inferiority complex. I don't know if we're born with it, but I know Adler is the person, his psychology is the psychology that I use. And just to give you a quick reference point, Adler was around at the time of Freud and Carl Jung and some of the other big hitters in psychology, but he was kind of passed over. Like people that even take psychology, they don't really remember much about him. I just read a book about him about a year ago, and the authors said that Adler was at least 100 years ahead of his time. So 100 years from where he was in his time of birth and death, he would now be 30, 100 years from that. Right now he would be 30. And I have been saying since the mid 80s that Adler was ahead of his time because he understood what causes the core of all struggling and war, and even the ones that happen from narcissists. They come from inferiority complex and the severity of inferiority complex. If any of you listen to Brene Brown's work, it's on shame. And she's so famous right now. She's written books and done TED Talks and has, things on Audible. And when she's invited to speak, there are still lots of people that will say, Renee, we really want you to come speak, but let's not have you talk on that shame stuff. It's a little dark and it makes people uncomfortable. And she says, until we get comfortable with facing our hardcore shame, it'll be my number one platform. Well, the same was true of Adler. Adler was all about understanding that we're either feeding what's called the inferiority complex or we're healing it. I'll just put it that way. So what most people do is they walk around and on the surface of their life, they look as if everything's okay. They're well groomed. They put a smile on their face. It's all thumbs up. Everything's great. But often what's underneath is a sense of shame, vulnerability, confusion. Those years that I had been through the divorce and was completely confused, I really had a lot of bleakness around that because I couldn't sort it. And there's other things that cause us to go into this bleak place. So what happens is when we're in conditions and conversations that stir up and increase our inferiority feelings, we will go into uninterrupted struggles. It's really important to make the connection between the two. The discouragement from the shame throws us into uninterrupted struggles. For some of us who are empathic, that usually turns into internal struggles where we're overweight because we're addictively eating or we're addictively smoking or we're addictively drinking or we're addictively something, or we're addictive in our relationships, or we're suffering from anxiety or depression, or we're ill a lot because it takes a toll on our body to be in shame, or we have that problem that we initially talked about, creating money and wealth, and we go into indebtedness. And we go into disengagement and stress. And, so those are all very easy to see in the public, that there's lots of us that are stuck in those struggles. It's also about external struggles where we're doing win-lose dynamics, righteousness, I'm right, you're wrong, the greed and the dishonesty and the corruption and the coercion that's going on. All the isms are rooted in inferiority complex. All war, all estrangement, all negative behavior. So it's a big deal to look at, we got this thing called inferiority complex, and if we don't deal with it, this is the result. So what we need instead are conditions and conversations that bring about healthy belonging and significance. So when we have that, when we have healthy belonging and significance, it's the only time we feel 4 core feelings, 4 core needs. So when that's going on, we feel empowered. You can kind of see it right now with the events that are unfolding around maybe the protesters that are saying, I finally feel like others are hearing me, or I have influence, or I can be potent in my life instead of feeling impotent. So empowered is very important when you have the healthy belonging and significance. This one is less easy for people to understand at first glance. Most people say, you want us to feel empowered and loved. Lovable is not the same as loved. Lovable is when you feel seen and heard by other people on an intellectual and an emotional level. Part of the reason I think that I could even have gotten involved with a narcissist and could have gotten involved with more than one narcissist, for me personally, I was raised in a family where while they were very loving, they were very dismissive of any thoughts of my own. They were kind of common parents in that they thought I was a blank slate that they were supposed to write on. And when you're helping people feel lovable, you're not telling them how to think and feel. You're not telling them what you approve of or disapprove of. You're really being receptive to them with no agenda to fix them, convert them, or change them. You're actually even doing more than being receptive. You're delighting in them. So I want you to understand that distinction, that feeling lovable is not feeling loved. It was actually quite confusing to me to receive love from my parents and yet not feel lovable. I was like starving from a very specific nutrient, and I didn't understand that that was mixed in with other good things. Another feeling we have to experience in healthy belonging and significance is a sense of connection. Where we disconnect, that's where violence and struggle and shame and all of that is activated. In fact, when you think about the kids that go shoot up a school, it's usually because they feel so isolated and disconnected. that they will do more violent kinds of retaliation behaviors. So connected is a very important. Right now, there are whole groups of people in our communities that have gone a long time feeling disconnected or poorly connected. And that's why they're finally, feeling more connection at times. And it's super important to us all having a joint feeling of belonging and significance together, both in the giving and receiving of that connection. This is another tough one, kind of like lovable. When you feel that you can bring solutions to the table, you feel a sense of significance and belonging that you would not otherwise feel. But here's the rub. Because we're so often suffering from our own version of shame or inferiority complex, we don't even like to reach out and ask for help from anybody or ask for any kind of contribution of ideas and things like that, because we're feeling so insecure that we will rob people of opportunities to make contributions. I remember working with school districts where I'd say, instead of bribing parents to come to a parent-teacher meeting, ask them to bring a bottle of soda. Ask them to bring a quote to open the meeting, an inspiring quote. Ask them to share a story about one of their students in the meeting as part of the initial opening of the meeting. Give them something small that they can succeed at and feel proud to contribute. It's way more important to them than bribing them. Actually, bribing them has a lot of counterproductive consequences to it. So these are super important to remember. You guys had said in the survey that you have trouble being authentic and you have trouble with worrying too much about what other people think. And I will tell you that part of the reason that's occurring is that we don't have conditions where you feel empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing. So it makes it a lot harder to show up as authentic because you're fighting against your own sense of shame and inferiority. And it doesn't mean that you're not a lot of times winning the battle, despite the fact that I went through years of shame and confusion around all that narcissism and everything. I still was able to do good things. It's just that I wasn't as free as I could have been. Understanding brings freedom to be authentic. So I want to share with you some information that I think is really, really powerful and tie it back to some of the things I've already been saying. This is the work of a man named M. Scott Peck, who wrote the book, The Road Less Traveled. This information was from a book he wrote called The Different Drummer, and it was around teamwork. And so what he did was he defined these stages that get us to authentic teamwork with one another. I think this is just brilliant work. So what he basically said is that the first stage we share with people when we're in relationship is called pseudo-community. In a romantic relationship, this is often called the honeymoon phase. But really with every relationship, initially, we're eager to see what we have in common. We're eager to see how alike we are. If we haven't been preconditioned against somebody, that is, but if we just meet somebody the first time, we're kind of open to, oh, wow, you like sports too, and that kind of thing. What happens in pseudo community is some people are terrified to step outside of that. So they don't want to acknowledge when we have disagreements. They don't want to acknowledge differences. They're fearful of making waves or breaking, harmony or something. And so they will play it safe in pseudo community. And whenever somebody can't move outside of pseudo community, they become inauthentic. They become somewhat fake and duplicitous in a way, because they refuse to acknowledge real things that are happening. You can see that right now about people waking up about what's been going on between the races. I mean, we've been in pseudo community, many, many of us. So it causes a lack of innovation, creativity, healing, all kinds of things. But what happens that makes us feel afraid to get out of it is what's called chaos. And chaos is when we finally start admitting that we have differences and we rush to think it's the other person's problem. So in chaos, what we do is we hold an attitude toward the opposite person that they need to be converted, fixed, healed, and changed. So even when we think of, if you think of the Native Americans and how the people would come in and say, oh, the poor heathens, we need to heal them of their heathen ways, right? And what right did we have to hold them as lesser, as we're right, they're wrong? So you can see it everywhere. You can see it on social media. You can see it in different things that are occurring right now and have always occurred, where we do win-lose, where we do I'm right, you're wrong. My job is to fix you, convert you, heal you, and change you. So what happens is people leave relationships when this hits, or they stay in relationships but leave emotionally, or at workplaces they disengage. Maybe they stay for the paycheck, or maybe they leave altogether, which is high turnover. This is where people will sometimes go back and forth between chaos and pseudo community because they're just trying to hang on by a thread. It's not healthy. It's not authentic. It's not even authentic within ourselves because it's coming from fear. When we believe it's our job, first and foremost, to fix you, convert you, heal you, change you, and ultimately blame you, we are in fear. So how do you get around this? In his book, M. Scott Peck said, you go to something other than either of those. And in this state, he called it empty. And empty is not intended to sound bleak. Empty is intended to remind us that it's empty of all the agenda that's in chaos. In chaos, the agenda is fix you, convert you, heal you, change you. In empty, you're not doing that. In empty, you're practicing receptivity. I tried to pick a picture of somebody that looked curious and compassionate, just the way that his demeanor is curious and compassionate. When you are in empty with somebody, you are receptive to hearing them and what they think and feel. You're asking them to be the same because you're willingly and openly disclosing how you think and feel, but with no agenda to change them. You're both practicing respect, seeing each other as human beings, not objects. And you're very much going the extra step of recognizing that this person has differences, different gifts, different strengths, different life experiences that deserve to be appreciated. Very, very opposite of chaos. Sometimes where people get stuck in this is they say, well, why would I want to spend time in empty? Nothing is gotten done. Like no solutions are being offered in empty. And the reality of it is a lot is being done. And you can't get to solutions without stopping here. Because if I don't know that you actually see me as important as you see yourself, I don't want to do business with you. I don't want to be in a relationship with you. I don't want to be influenced by you. So it's very important that we establish mutual value with one another in order to be in authenticity. The reason you're not feeling authentic is it hasn't been safe to be authentic a lot of the time for most of us. And I'm just speaking generally now. I'm speaking that most of the time we are not having or experiencing psychological safety. So of course we would struggle with what other people think of us. Of course we would struggle with showing up. So what happens is when we're successful in navigating through this place of acceptance and respect and curiosity and compassion, now we're in a position to be honest and straightforward and communicate about the excellent kinds of conditions we want to create together. Like I had somebody say to me, you need to go in and clean up all the police departments. And I said, I would not approach it that way. I would look at it as let's take a cross section of everybody involved in a community and look at where we all need to learn this stuff together. Because otherwise I'm holding a dynamic of I'm right, they're wrong. And it doesn't mean they're not wrong. It just means that I'm not always right. And that we all have a problem that's bigger than blame, that has more to do with how do we look at the system. So rather than asking, why is this happening and who's to blame? You want to ask questions like, what system, if it was put in place, would help all of us have a different experience? So when you go through empty and you achieve authentic community, there's honesty, there's openness, there's follow through, there's resolved problems that are resolved quickly because it's not a blame fest. It's not a gossip fest. So I just want you to know two things. You, of course, would struggle with authenticity, and here's why. And then the second is it's more powerful than you know to go from chaos to empty, or even to get in the habit of skipping chaos altogether and just practicing empathy and quickly leading into authentic community. So another thing that I want you to know about relationships that aren't working, and this is the hardest thing for me to communicate. I still feel like I'm hitting walls all the time around this. And I would even say that right now I'm struggling to write an article called Pulling Out All the Roots, because the roots that I'm spitting in right now are the ones I'm going to share with you in a minute. And spitting in the soup is a term that Adler actually coined in addition to inferiority complex. And it basically means taking something that looks healthy and wholesome and putting something into it so that you recognize that it's not so wholesome. So if somebody came and spit in your soup, you probably wouldn't want to eat it. And that's really what I'm going to do around what I'm going to share next. I want you to be disgusted by the way that I'm presenting the facts to you so that you no longer want to use the very things that are at the core of all racism, all inferiority complex, all addictions, all the challenges in your survey, all the challenges in our lives. They come from really basic core practices that even begin in our homes and in our schools. And these are called the cultures of control. So the cultures of control include some that are maybe recognizable to you and some that maybe you've never considered, and maybe even all four of them, maybe ones that you hold dear. I know a lot of people hold these dear and they're quick to go back to them because they're widely promoted and they're widely prescribed and they're widely championed. And that's why I'm as vehemently as possible spitting in the soup of them. So the first one is the autocratic mind and behavior set. When you hold the belief that it's your job to use domination and force, the belief you're holding is that it's my job to manage you. You can't be trusted. It's my job to get you to do what I tell you to do, just because sometimes. At worst, you have people that are resentfully compliant. And at worst, you have people that rebel and resist. At best, you have people that are compliant, but it's resentful compliant, which carries a high price tag. So there are a lot of organizations that are starting to realize we don't want to do this to our employees, but there's a lot of them that still resort to this, because they think, well, gosh, if I don't do something autocratic, I'm going to have anarchy. I mean, you see it right now. It's like a battle right now in our America, whether we're going to continue to use control versus something else. So I just want you to be aware that this is very prevalent right now. Here's a control model you might not be so familiar with. This is when you use incentives and rewards to try to get people to be good citizens. So you're holding a belief that if I didn't dangle a carrot in front of you, your basic state of being is selfish and lazy. And that it's even my job to manage your motivation. It's my job to get you to jump through the hoop that I have for you. And what's been found in all the research, originally there was research that looked as if incentives and rewards were a good thing, but it turns out that research was all done on animals where they work every single time. But in the research on using incentives and rewards with human beings, what it does is it breaks down. It's not only ineffective, it's counterproductive. It breaks down the commitment to the very behaviors and mindsets that you want people to hold. So kind of like if I were a parent and I said, I'm going to give my kid $1 for every book he reads, it's sending the message to the kid, oh, it must really suck to read because they have to pay me to read. So that's the kind of dynamic that's set up. It also feels manipulative. It also creates a scarcity mindset when you start rewarding people, where they're now in competition with each other, where they're now rushing to get their prize, which makes them more selfish or self-focused, which makes them rush past quality because they're focused on getting the prize. I mean, it's really, really a big deal to get this. And so a lot of times when people say, well, if you're taking away my autocratic mindset, how could you take away my rewards too? I've had people scream at me about this. They really can't believe this could be true. Here's another one. I remember reading about this in the books of the people that are writing about rewards. They said this is a subtler version of rewards or punishments, and it's in using judgment or measurements as though you are set up as somebody higher that gets to bestow criticism or bestow praise. Praise is very different than encouragement. So I don't want you to think I'm saying encouragement is a bad thing, but I'm talking about when somebody says to their employee, go out and make me proud, where now it's all about the authority figure. Or I'm so disappointed in you, where it's always about like your job is to please me. And what this creates is it creates in some people a conditioning to become people pleasers and conformists, and to not stand up with authenticity, to be complicit in things that aren't even their belief system. I did this growing up. I felt like I was complicit because there was so much control in my childhood that I chose that to survive it and I had to forgive it. But that's what happens when we get really focused on this whole notion of pleasing the authority figure. And what happens also in a healthier sense is sometimes people see this judgment and say, who died made you God? And they rebel against it. And that's a good thing. But what's so hard, and this is what was so interesting to me when I read about this, it's very hard for all of us to stay out of this particular control model, because as soon as we're triggered into our inferiority complex, one way that we can feel a sense of fake power is to puff up and judge other people and to bestow that judgment. It gives us a sense of temporary respite from the pain and the suffering of feeling ashamed and confused and unsure of ourselves. And so it's a real easy one to slip into, but it is a control model. This one is also surprising to people. We can fall into a belief and a behavior that is, I don't really have faith in you. I'm going to overcompensate for you. Anytime you see an authority figure telling somebody something they should already know, doing for them something that they already know how to do, all of that kind of behavior is a pampering and spoiling kind of behavior that signals you can't. I mean, the worst case example I can think of is when the celebrity parents would pay to have their kids' tests tampered with so that they would pass, into these Ivy League schools. Talk about overcompensate. That's not going to create a high-performing, highly responsible, highly ethical adult when you have people that think it's okay to enable or to push something through artificially that sets up a sense of entitlement. And I'm telling you that all of these things are done, quote unquote, well-intentioned. And we're very addicted to them because they appear to work in the initial response to these things. If I held a gun to your head, I could probably get you to do what I wanted you to do. If I offered you $1,000 to do something I want, if it wasn't completely against your ethics, you would probably do it. So it looks like these things work. What we don't see are all the negative behaviors that we cultivate and all the negative thinking we're holding about people that cause a breakdown in their sense of self, do not help them feel empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing, and therefore contribute to all of the kinds of struggles that we see internally and externally. So I just want to tie all that together. This is chaos. This is part of chaos. This is opposite of healthy belonging and significance, and it's happening in childhood first. That's why when I think about what's going on right now in our country, not only around racism, but around ageism, around sexism, around just any kind of ism, it's all the same. It's all the same fountain from which it's all springing. And the reason this is so dangerous is it's puppetry. I'm extrinsically motivating you to do what I want you to do through my efforts and my belief system, not yours, but mine. So when I say that my mission is to create a world where people love their lives, you can't love your life if I'm constantly trying to control your behavior. And that's really true for all of us. So Einstein said something very powerful. He said, we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. If I could get people to think one way new, I would want them to look at the thinking we use with the control models. How we're trying to solve problems by continuously going back to those control models and not recognizing how dangerous and harmful and threatening they actually are. And so we dismiss it like, changing the way we think punitively and all that, that's not such a big deal. We just need to stop people from doing chokeholds. No, we need to see the thinking we used is creating our willingness to be so ugly with each other and so cold and ruthless with each other, whether it's large or small. So we really can't solve our problems with the same thinking of control methods. What do we want instead? We want relationships that are based on faith in each other. So if you remember in those 4 control models, all the beliefs about people were very negative and limiting and fearful beliefs about people. In this kind of mindset, in this kind of system, the belief you hold about people is either you are great or you might not be acting great, but you want to be great. I believe you want that. I believe that's who you are and that's who you want to be. When you're not showing up that way, I'm going to assume it's because your conditions and conversations are not yet allowing you to feel sufficient of these 4 core needs. You're not feeling sufficient healthy belonging and significance. So when you're in this mindset, the goal is always about mentoring. It's always about transferring responsibility. If you're a parent, it doesn't mean you do all of the mentoring, and it doesn't mean that the child can't mentor you back. It just means that mentoring should be occurring regularly. So when you guys are answering the questions, I don't have a regular support system. I don't have a regular coach. I don't have a regular mentor. I would really encourage you to understand that this is the way out of control models, is to work with people who can help you to pick up responsibility for your own tasks. And by that, I mean the tasks for managing your relationships, managing your productivity, managing your mood, managing your engagement level, managing your purpose, values, visions, goals, procedures, and roles, your plan for that. And that comes from using intrinsic motivation, helping you discover. So in our mentoring that we teach is very Socratic. And I'm hoping to spend some time with you guys actually seeing what I mean, because I want you to bring real problems to the table, and I will mentor you through those the way you would be able to do after you have a set of tools and a process for doing things. So I want to consider some tools with you as the next step. So we have about 30 minutes left to do this, but I also want to tell you a quick story, and I'm happy to send you the long version of the story. It's really powerful, and it's about a student in a school where one classroom was learning all these tools and all these mindsets that I'm describing, but they were the only class in the entire school. And this is the only part I'm going to tell you. They had this new tool that was introduced to the school called the Peace Pledge. So in the morning when the kids were putting their hands on their hearts and saying the Pledge of Allegiance, they were also asked to keep their hand on their heart and make this pledge to each other. I pledge to use my words and actions for peace. Now, ironically, the homeroom teacher, who was not doing our training, said to the kids with all seriousness, if I catch any of you not doing this pledge, you're going to get a detention. And the reason that's so important in what we're going to do next is I wouldn't even introduce you to a tool without you seeing the spit in the soup, because that teacher was taking a beautiful tool, a beautiful concept like a peace pledge, and laying it over top of the control models, using an autocratic approach to try to get a peace pledge. And that's what we do. We try to come in and change behavior at the surface. It's like pulling a weed out at the surface and not getting to the core of the weed, which just causes the weed to keep growing back. And the same is true of introducing tools without a shift in mindset and an understanding of the difference between chaos and empty, for example. Or is this tool and the way I'm using it causing people to feel empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing? So I just wanted to kind of give you that understanding of why I've set this foundation about inferiority complex and authenticity, etc. So I would like to invite you right now to work with me on, because this whole thing really is about, should I stay or should I go? So if I were in a mentoring session with you, one of the things I would ask you, in addition to telling you the purpose of the organization, which I've already started and opened with, and telling you how much I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you being a learner and a seeker and the vulnerability with which you answered your survey. After that, I would start with, where are any of your relationships not at a 10? So a relationship that's at a 10 is one in which you generally feel empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing within. You feel a high level of trust. So these behaviors that I'm showing you, these 8 behaviors, are occurring in relationships where you have a 10. You could have a 10 with somebody and not be best friends. You could have a 10 with somebody and not necessarily agree with their worldview, but you have straightforwardness and honesty and receptivity and respect and disclosure and all these things here. So when a relationship is not a 10, it means there's something in it that's kind of a barrier to a well-functioning. It'd be like if you went to the doctor and you had a fever, you'd want to know, I need to do something. There's some reason I have a fever. Same is true when you look at your relationships and you say, I have a couple that are not at a 10. That's your way of acknowledging, I have a couple relationships that I'm either going to walk from, ignore, pretend with, and be pseudo-community, or I'm going to say these are ones I'm going to see if I can fix before I discard them altogether. That's just really important as a priority. This is what I would recommend to you, that you make the relationships in your life either ones that you are going to work on to keep them at a 10, or that you're going to spend the minimum amount of time with them because they're so toxic and unfixable, because either you've tried everything or you recognize how consistently the symptoms are narcissistic, etc. So